A couple of days ago, I made a video on the Lemming defense, which is a very rare defense. And in the video today, I'll be doing a part 2 of that defense, which will go over some more deeper lines, some more analysis, and a lot more to share with you. So if you haven't watched that video, I think it's a great introduction, so definitely watch that in the description of this video. But let's begin. So the Lemming defense is, of course, e4 and now knight to a6. And I talked in the first video a little bit about why the horrible look and how bad this seems is kind of deceiving because, of course, first of all, if they take, that's not much of an issue. It opens up the bishop onto this very nice diagonal. It opens up the rook. And these pawns are on the corner of the board, so all of your central pawns are still there, so you have a lot of central control, and you get to develop your pieces really quickly and to very active squares. And so this move doesn't really, it's not that good for white. And then if white just tries to get more space, and we'll analyze this deeper today, but the main goals, like I shared in the other video, is to put your knight eventually onto c7 with your pawn on c6, and to push for the move d5 with all of your pieces supporting that push, and that is how you're going to get your central control, and that is how this knight is going to become a lot more active, because it's not going to stay here on the side of the board. So that's kind of what we went over last video, and in the video today we'll be looking at a bit longer lines and a bit deeper analysis of all sorts of moves like d4 here. We'll look at knight to c3, knight to f3, we'll look at e5 even, we'll look at even the move g3. So by the end of this video, you're going to have a lot more ideas and plans from this opening so you can play this a bit more successfully. So let's begin with the move d4, I think. This is probably the most common you're going to see, just getting all of the center. Now here, you could play the move c6. That is a perfectly fine move to play. It's kind of the go-to move in this opening, and you're going to reach a very good position with this line. But before we continue with this line, I quickly want to mention another option for you, which is to be a bit more aggressive in c5. And because the pawn is here, c5 actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, if they take, your knight gets developed very quickly and to a much more active square than on c7. So that's another way to move the knight out, by moving it to c5. And you really shouldn't be worried about bishop takes here. It might seem like they're taking away the defender, but you don't take with the pawn. You could, but a better option is to give a check. They probably won't move their king. Maybe they'll block, and then take the bishop. And even though you are down a pawn here, you have a lot of compensation. So for example, e5, they have these double pawns here, as you see. The bishop's immediately attacking this pawn, and they probably should just let the pawn go. But if they try to defend the pawn, then you can punish this by going b6, and after takes, taking with the pawn, notice opening up both the rook and queen, and you have a lot of attacking chances. So knight to f3, for example, here, you can play knight to f6. It's actually hard to find a good move for white. I mean, they can't castle because of your queen. They can't move the bishop because they'll lose this pawn. They can't develop the knight because they'll lose this pawn. It's very hard to find a good move here. So maybe they'll try the move, for example, well, like I said, knight c3 doesn't work. So maybe e5, you simply move your knight to a very good square, actually, where it's actually pressuring b4 even. They defend. Now queen to c4 comes, attacking this pawn even further. So through this line, even though it's a very specific line, and now actually notice that they can't defend the pawn because they'll lose this pawn here. And so if they maybe try the move, well, actually, if they go queen b3, you can simply take, because if they take, they lose the rook. And if they try the move a3, for example, then you can simply play bishop a6 and tie them down even further. The queen cannot move anywhere because it will get checkmated, and their whole position is tied down, and you're completely dominating here. So this was a very specific line, but the point I'm trying to make is you shouldn't really be worried about giving them this extra c5 pawn, because you're going to get a lot in response. You're going to open up your files, your knights and bishops from the king side are going to transition to the queen side, and you're going to have a lot of pressure built up. Taking is not the best option here. And so instead, in this position, they could maybe try the move, let's say d5. Here, you can simply play d6, lock up the position, and eventually develop your pieces, move your knight back to c7, and you have a pretty positional game here. It's a very close position, but you can look to break open the position with e6. And after takes, notice you have a lot of central pawns here and a lot of mass in the center of the board. You can eventually use that to push for d5. You'll develop your bishop, castle, and you're perfectly fine here. So that is one option for them if they want to push the pawn. That doesn't end up being that good for white. So taking isn't amazing, pushing isn't amazing. Like I showed, bishop takes isn't the best. And so here, maybe they want to play the move knight f3 and defend the pawn, but then you can simply take and target this pawn here on e4 and put your knight in a very active square. So the whole point of c5 was to trade off these pawns and then put a knight here onto c5 where it's very active, already pressuring here. They can develop and defend. Now d6 comes, you develop your other knight, and here you can play the move g6 to develop your bishop. Notice you don't really want to go e6. It does a lot of weaknesses. It locks your bishop here, and both of your bishops are kind of a bit locked here. It also weakens this pawn, so in the future they can try to add pressure onto this pawn here. So it makes a bit more sense to develop your bishop this way, and if you do this way, then you're perfectly fine in this position. So overall, the move c5 is a great line, but again, if you don't want to start memorizing different move orders, c6 is perfectly fine, and I'll go a bit more in depth here. They can play the move e5, in which case you can play g6 again to develop your bishop, and you're going to notice a lot of times that you're going to develop your bishop this way. But in this specific case, you can also, if you want, go e6 and develop your bishop this way with the idea of going c5, and you're kind of transforming into more of a French-like position. So those are a couple of options for you if they push, and then if they take the pawn instead, you can simply take. Let's say they develop their knight, you develop your knight, they can castle. Here, again, bishop to f5, you don't want to go e6 immediately, you lock in this bishop, so first you can develop your bishop. Let's say they develop their bishop, and now the move g6. Notice if you go e6 now, you allow this move knight to b5. And if you take, then it actually is quite bad for you after knight to e5. And there's a lot of pressure onto this pawn here, which is why it's typically a bit better to keep this bishop having the ability to go back to d7. So playing the move g6 makes a bit more sense. And typically in this opening, what I've noticed by analyzing all these lines is that g6 is often a much more safer and a much better way to develop this bishop. So if you're ever in doubt, I would recommend going for g6 to develop the bishop. And then you can always also go for a6 if you're ever scared of this knight to b5 idea. A6 is a great way to kind of shut that down forever. But for the most part, this is, again, completely fine. All of these lines are giving you wonderful chances in this game, and I think that is, for the most part, everything about d4. So another option that they have instead of d4 is, let's look at knight to f3. Here, you can play the move c6, of course, the normal move here. And if they play bishop takes, it is a little bit worse for you here, because notice that you can't really ever put your bishop onto a6, which is typically a very active diagonal for you. And also, if you put your bishop on b7, this pawn is kind of blocking it. So this is a better option for white to take in this case. Once you've committed to c6, then they can take. But even that is not so bad, and the way you can deal with that is to just put all of your pieces and prepare the move d5. And then as to how you're going to develop this bishop, you can eventually try to fianchetto it, but if you fianchetto it, you weaken all of these dark squares. So a better way here would actually just be knight to g6 and then developing the bishop to e7. And then if we look at this other bishop here again, there's quite a problem, but you can play the move a5, and this is something that I would definitely keep in your kind of toolbox in this opening, because often they're going to double your pawn, so be ready to play a5 to open up this square for your bishop. That's a really cool idea here, and like I said, the knight typically will develop here, and then the bishop will be freed, because if you play the move g6, then you're just creating a lot of dark square weaknesses around your king, and even though maybe they can't use it immediately, it's just not that advised. Okay, so that is kind of what happens if they take, but of course they don't have to take. So what if they just develop their pieces? Well, this really is perfectly fine for you. I think we've already reached this position where we looked at these two options. And if they don't play any of those options, you can definitely just take, develop your bishop. I mean, you're in a completely fine and reasonable position here. So we did look at all these options, but e5, I think we can go a bit deeper into e5. So for example, if they develop their bishop, you can fianchetto your bishop again. And notice that here you can also go for e6 and try to play a French way, but then this bishop becomes a bit more locked. So g6, again, typically is going to be a better option in this opening. You can develop your bishop now, and you can play a bit of a strange move, knight to h6 here. And it's kind of funny because both of your knights, their first move was to go to the side of the board, but again, kind of like this knight, it's not going to stay here. Your idea is to move eventually the knight to f5. So, for example, bishop to d2, knight to f5. Notice, not really worried about h3 because you can always take. You're not going to get stuck with h5 and you know, you're not going to blunder this g4 idea. You can always just take, and in this case, you're actually even winning a pawn because you're removing the defender here. So knight to f5 is very powerful even because it's just threatening this pawn because of the pin. And so typically the knight on f5 is a very strong piece here. And if they take, this is perfectly fine for you. You can take with the bishop to preserve your pawn structure. Although, even though I didn't analyze it, maybe taking with the pawn isn't even that bad. I'll quickly turn on the engine. There's some lines in the Caro-Kann where taking with the pawn actually makes sense. Actually, apparently taking with the pawn is completely fine here. They're both basically equal. Yeah, they're both equal, and actually both of these moves lead to basically a completely drawn position. So those are two options for you. But the point is, it's not really, you shouldn't fear them taking this knight here. They're giving you their double bishop pair. Okay, and then from here, again, like I said, h3 doesn't make much sense because they're going to lose a pawn, and so that works quite well for you. Okay, so we've looked at, in this position, if they play d4. We've looked at if they already take, and also knight to f3. But what about knight to c3? This really will just transpose because often their knight will come to c3 anyways. So here, for example, c6, and then d4, knight to c7. And notice that, I mean, we just got the exact same position that we've always had with d5 here to bust open the center. So we've already seen this position very often. And a lot of times, and so you really should not fear it. Okay, and then aside from that, I mean, their other options are not that amazing. e5 is something that has been tried before, so I want to quickly look at it, but you can play d6. Notice that c6 is a bit unnecessary. Maybe they can take, and the pawn being so forward, it makes it much harder for you to develop your pieces, and this bishop is again kind of stuck here, so maybe this is a little bit uncomfortable for you, which is why I would recommend to just go d6, challenge this pawn here immediately. If they defend the pawn with the pawn, you can simply take and play the move c5 even here. You don't have to go, for example, to c6. You can just go c5 immediately, and then eventually put your knight on c7, and this c5 pawn is just grabbing more space in the center. And then if they defend with the knight instead, the only like real trick to be careful of is takes. You don't want to play the move c5 here, because if you play c5, you actually blunder your queen after takes. You have to give away your queen, and this is a very bad position for you. So in a position like this, if their knight lands here, the only thing to be careful of is not to play c5 and weaken this diagonal. Instead, simply develop your pieces, and you might be worried about them sacking the knight and then winning this fork, but you really should not be worried about this because this end position is actually really favorable for you. Your queen is active, all of your pieces are developed, so even though you might be down a little bit in material, you have a lot more space. They haven't developed anything, and it's just a really good position here for black, even if you are down a bit material. Okay, so moving back, that's kind of what happens with e5. You can simply challenge it with d6. And their other options are to go maybe g3. I've seen this in over-the-board game with the idea to develop the bishop, but really, again, you shouldn't worry any of these weird moves like e5 or g6. You can continue with your plan here of c6. So bishop g2, knight to c7, they develop their knight, and again, you can push for this d5 push. At some point, you can develop your knight. This is a perfectly fine position here for black. Awesome, I think that's kind of gonna wrap up the video for today. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe so you never miss more content like this, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.